Good morning, everyone. When we talk about habits, we are actually talking about the brain's ability to change neuroplasticity in action. Today, I want to walk you through 5 critical signs that reveal how habits are formed, maintained, or broken, all grounded in science. Let's begin. When we talk about the science of habits, one of the foundational principles is that habits are encoded through repetition and reward loops. This isn't just behavioral, it's deeply rooted in how the brain is structured and how it prioritizes energy efficiency. At the neurological level, habits are not singular actions, but rather sequences of neural firing patterns that have been rehearsed so often they become automatic. The part of the brain most responsible for this process is the basal ganglia, a set of subcortical structures involved in motor control, emotion, and most importantly for our purposes, habit formation. What's remarkable about the basal ganglia is that once it identifies a behavior that produces a reliable outcome, it starts to automate it. This process is not about memory in the traditional sense. It's about efficiency. Let's take an example: brushing your teeth. Initially, as a child, brushing your teeth is something you're told to do. It requires reminders and effort. But over time, it becomes second nature. You might not even remember the exact moment you brushed your teeth this morning, not because your memory is faulty, but because it's been relegated to habit memory, a different system. Episodic memory, the brain chunks the behavior into a unit and stores it for automatic execution. This shift from conscious to unconscious behavior is exactly what the habit loop does. So, how does this loop work? It begins with a cue, something in your environment or internal state that triggers a behavior. It could be a time of day, a location, an emotion, or even the presence of another person. Then comes the routine, the behavior itself. Finally, there's the reward, a neurochemical feedback that tells your brain this action was valuable. Over time, the brain begins to predict the reward, and this is where dopamine comes into play. Dopamine, often misunderstood as the pleasure chemical, is actually a motivation and learning molecule. It spikes not when you receive a reward, but in anticipation of one. So when the brain identifies a cue that's consistently followed by a rewarding behavior, it starts to release dopamine even before the behavior starts. This is called reward prediction. It increases your drive to perform the habit again, reinforcing the loop. What's critical here is that repetition matters more than intensity. You don't need massive rewards or extreme behaviors to form a habit. You need consistency. Every time a cue leads to a behavior that leads to a reward, the neural pathway is strengthened. This is called long-term potentiation, and it's the cellular basis of learning. Neurons that fire together wire together. The more frequently you perform a behavior in response to a cue, the more embedded it becomes in your neural circuitry. This is why even seemingly small, harmless behaviors, like checking your phone when you're bored, can turn into powerful habits. The cue, boredom, leads to the behavior, checking your phone, which delivers the reward, novelty, social connection, distraction. Repeat this loop enough and it becomes automatic. You reach for your phone before your prefrontal cortex, your decision-making center, even gets involved. Now here's where it becomes actionable. Understanding that every habit follows this loop gives you a framework for building new habits and breaking old ones. If you want to create a new habit, you start by designing a consistent cue, making the behavior as easy and repeatable as possible, and ensuring there's some kind of immediate reward, even if it's as subtle as a sense of satisfaction or completion. Over time, your brain will learn to predict that reward, and the habit will become automatic. If you want to break a habit, you need to interrupt the loop. That could mean removing or avoiding the cue, replacing the routine with something new, or changing the reward structure. Importantly, you also need to recognize that early attempts to break a habit will feel like friction because they are efficient, but because the systems has that reactance isn't changed earlier, it's a sign that the system was deeply wired, and you're now engaging neuroplasticity to change it. The more frequently you make the new choice, the more those new neural pathways are strengthened. With repetition and reward, even new behaviors that once felt foreign or effortful, like meditation, exercise, or waking up early, can become as automatic as your most ingrained habits. So remember, repetition builds the circuit, and reward seals it in. When we talk about what actually motivates human behavior, whether it's pursuing goals, repeating habits, or falling into compulsive loops, we are, in essence, talking about dopamine. This molecule plays a far more nuanced and vital role than it's often credited for. It's not just about feeling good, it's about driving motivation, craving, attention, and reinforcement. To understand how habits form and stick, or why we feel an uncontrollable urge to repeat certain behaviors, both positive and negative, we have to understand how dopamine operates. Dopamine is released in a part of the brain called the mesolimbic pathway, particularly in the ventral tegmental area VTA, and then projected to the nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex, and other structures involved in decision, making, reward anticipation, and action. Now here's where it gets critical. Dopamine doesn't just spike after you do something enjoyable. It spikes before the action when you predict that a reward is coming. This is known as dopamine prediction signaling or incentive salience. It's what creates craving and sets the behavior in motion. It's the neurochemical signature of anticipation. Let's consider a simple real-world example. You see your phone screen light up. Your brain knows from past experience that this could mean a new message, a like, or a video. Instantly, a small burst of dopamine is released, not because of the content itself, but because of the possibility of a reward. That spike of dopamine motivates you to check your phone. Over time, the brain learns that this cue, phone lighting up, leads to an action, checking it, that often results in a reward, novelty, validation, or connection. This loop, when repeated, becomes a habit. What's more fascinating is that dopamine works on a prediction error basis. If the reward is greater than expected, dopamine spikes higher. If the reward is as expected, the dopamine level stays steady. But if the reward is less than expected or absent, dopamine actually drops below baseline, which we experience as disappointment or a craving left unsatisfied. This is a major reason why variable rewards, like those found in slot machines or social media, are so addictive. They keep the brain guessing and chasing that next dopamine hit. Now, here's the deeper insight. The stronger the dopamine response, the stronger the habit loop becomes. It's why certain behaviors like checking notifications, scrolling endlessly, or eating sugar-laden snacks can become automatic and compulsive. The brain wires them in tightly because the craving reward cycle is heavily reinforced by dopamine. Importantly, dopamine is also tied to effort and goal-directed behavior. Studies have shown that higher dopamine levels increase the likelihood of taking on effortful tasks, even without immediate reward. This means that we can hijack the dopamine system for good by learning how to increase it around positive habits. For example, pairing new behaviors with novelty, celebrating small wins, and focusing on long-term goals can all amplify dopamine in ways that help reinforce productive habits. Let's say you want to build a habit of exercising regularly. The behavior itself might not be intrinsically rewarding in the beginning. But if you start by creating a consistent cue like laying out your clothes the night before, performing the behavior even just a 10-minute workout, and then giving yourself a mental reward such as writing down your progress or acknowledging the effort, your brain starts releasing dopamine in anticipation. With repetition, the behavior becomes easier and more automatic because it's now dopamine-driven. Conversely, when trying to break bad habits, it's not enough to simply remove the behavior. You must also disrupt the dopamine loop. That means eliminating or interrupting the cue, reducing exposure to reward, predicting stimuli, and creating friction that makes the behavior less automatic. Even more effective is to replace the habit with a new one that satisfies the same dopamine-driven need, whether that's stimulation, control, or stress relief. Ultimately, the brain is not interested in whether a behavior is good or bad. It's interested in what gets rewarded. Dopamine is the currency of that reward. It teaches your brain what to pursue, when to act, and how to focus. If we understand its timing and influence, we can begin to manipulate our own motivation systems, not through force or willpower, but through biology. By being intentional with cues, behavior design, and reward systems, we can sculpt dopamine pathways to support our goals, and in doing so, we rewire the brain to favor habits that serve us. One of the most telling signs of a deeply ingrained habit, especially one that's maladaptive or unhealthy, is that we begin to rationalize it. We create internal justifications like, "It's not a big deal, I deserve this," or "I'll quit after this one time." These aren't just weak moments or character flaws. They're signs of something deeper, a neurobiological tug-of-war between parts of the brain responsible for impulse and those responsible for long-term thinking. This internal conflict is primarily between two major systems: the limbic system, which governs emotional responses and reward-seeking behavior, and the prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of logic, planning, and self-control. The limbic system includes structures like the amygdala, hypothalamus, and nucleus accumbens, all heavily involved in generating and reinforcing habits. These are the evolutionarily older parts of the brain, designed for fast reactions and survival. They operate largely on emotion and immediate reward. So, when you feel the impulse to reach for junk food late at night or endlessly scroll through social media, that urge originates in this system. On the other hand, the prefrontal cortex is the most recently evolved part of the human brain. It enables you to plan, suppress impulses, forecast outcomes, and act according to long-term goals. When you set a New Year's resolution, delay gratification, or remind yourself to stay on track with your values, that's your prefrontal cortex in action. Now, here's where it gets interesting. These two systems are often in direct opposition when it comes to habits. And the brain doesn't always favor logic. If a behavior has been repeated enough times and tied to some form of reward, even a small one, it becomes automatic. The brain will default to the easier, familiar pathway, even if it contradicts your conscious goals. This is when rationalization kicks in, what you're experiencing when you talk yourself into. A bad habit is your prefrontal cortex trying to resolve conflict between what you know is best for you and what the reward system is urging you to do. The brain doesn't like unresolved tension. This is known as cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when our actions and values don't align. To ease that discomfort, the brain often creates a narrative to justify the behavior. And the more often you do this, the easier it becomes to repeat the behavior again, because the neural pathway becomes more entrenched. Let's break that down into neuroscience. When you rationalize a behavior, your brain is reconciling conflicting neural inputs. The prefrontal cortex is receiving input from the limbic system, urges, emotions, impulses, and simultaneously activating executive control networks that attempt to override those impulses. If the emotional or reward-driven input is strong enough, particularly if the dopamine response is high, the prefrontal cortex will lose the argument. And to resolve that inner tension, it may actually assist in justifying the decision post hoc. Over time, this loop, impulse, rationalization, action, becomes a shortcut. You may stop even noticing the conflict. This is how habits become deeply automatic and how self-deception becomes a built-in feature of certain routines. What's even more fascinating is that the strength of your prefrontal cortex can fluctuate depending on sleep, stress, nutrition, and even the time of day. For example, decision fatigue, the phenomenon where self-control wanes after too many decisions, makes it more likely you'll default to habitual behaviors and rationalize them. This is why it's harder to resist temptations late at night or after a long, demanding day. Understanding this internal conflict gives us powerful leverage. Instead of relying solely on willpower, which is a limited resource, we can design systems that reduce the likelihood of entering that rationalization loop in the first place. For example, change the environment to eliminate cues that trigger the old habit. Use implementation intentions, pre-decided rules like if I feel X, I'll do Y. Increase friction for the bad habit, e.g., remove apps from your phone. Reduce friction for the good habit, e.g., keep workout clothes ready. Use daily reflection to realign your prefrontal cortex with your long-term goals. When you begin to catch yourself in the act of rationalizing, that moment of internal debate, you're actually witnessing a key moment of neuroplasticity. That's when the brain is most changeable. It's your opportunity to strengthen the prefrontal pathways that support the behavior you want, not just the one that feels good temporarily. The key is not to fight against the brain, but to work with it. By understanding how these systems interact, you can design your days, your choices, and your environments to favor the long-term over the impulsive. With repetition, the new, healthier behavior becomes the default, and the need to rationalize simply disappears. One of the most powerful signs that a habit has become deeply rooted is that when you try to stop it, you don't just feel like something's missing, you feel irritable, anxious, or stressed. This isn't just psychological discomfort, it's a biological signal that the habit has been incorporated into your body's stress regulation system. And at the heart of this reaction is a powerful hormone, cortisol. Cortisol is often labeled the stress hormone, but its role is much more nuanced. It helps us mobilize energy, regulate blood sugar, increase alertness, and manage the body's fight or flight response. In acute situations, cortisol is beneficial. It helps you perform under pressure. But when it becomes chronically elevated, or when certain behaviors are used to regulate stress, the brain rewires around those behaviors as coping mechanisms. Let's say you develop the habit of scrolling your phone or snacking late at night as a way to unwind. Over time, your brain begins to associate those behaviors with temporary relief from stress. The moment you feel pressure, your system unconsciously craves that soothing input, not because it's helpful long-term, but because it lowers cortisol in the short term. Here's the biological loop. You encounter a stressor, mental or emotional, your cortisol rises, and the brain seeks out a behavior that previously helped decrease arousal. When you perform that behavior, let's say, watching Netflix with junk food, your brain gets a dose of dopamine and serotonin, neurotransmitters that help buffer stress. Cortisol drops temporarily, and what the brain learns very quickly is that this habit equals relief. This is how stress regulation habits form, even when they are not objectively healthy or aligned with your goals. And it explains why stopping such habits feels so difficult. It's not just about breaking a behavior, it's about disrupting a neuroendocrine feedback loop that your body is depending on to feel normal. Now, when you try to break this loop, for example, deciding to stop binge-eating at night or quit social media for a week, you experience a rebound in stress physiology. Cortisol rises, and because your go-to behavior is no longer available, your nervous system becomes dysregulated. This can show up as agitation, poor focus, cravings, anxiety, or even physical symptoms like headaches or fatigue. Many people interpret this experience as failure. I'm too weak to stop, or I can't handle this. But the reality is, your biology is simply doing what it's been trained to do. Your nervous system is expecting the habitual relief mechanism, and when it doesn't get it, it pushes back strongly. So, what can you do about it? The first step is recognizing that withdrawal, like stress from breaking a habit, is normal and even measurable. The key is to preemptively replace the habit with something that provides similar neurochemical rewards, but without the long-term costs. Think of this like substituting, not removing the stress relief. Instead of reaching for your phone, you might use deliberate cold exposure, which increases dopamine sustainably. Practice cyclical sighing or NSDR non-sleep deep rest to calm your autonomic nervous system. Engage in physical movement, such as a short walk or light exercise, which reduces cortisol and elevates serotonin. Journal or reflect with gratitude practices, which rewire neural circuits for positive emotion. The important thing is that the replacement habit must engage the brain's reward and relief systems. It should feel good, be easily accessible, and ideally, be tied to a new routine. The more you repeat this new pattern during times of stress, the more your brain learns to associate this behavior with that relief. Also, timing matters. Cortisol naturally peaks in the early morning and should decline toward evening. But when you're chronically stressed or dysregulated from habit withdrawal, cortisol can remain elevated into the night, impairing sleep and emotional regulation. That's why practicing stress, relieving habits during these key times morning and late afternoon, can help your system recalibrate. What neuroscience has made clear is that habits aren't just behavioral, they are hormonal and emotional feedback systems. If a habit helped you regulate stress, even poorly, your body has locked it in because it worked, at least temporarily. But here's the empowering part: the brain and body are highly adaptable. With consistency, awareness, and deliberate replacement, you can shift your cortisol patterns and build new, healthier regulation habits. And as those become reinforced, the withdrawal stress from the old habit gradually fades because the feedback loop has been rewired. Change doesn't come from fighting your biology. It comes from understanding it, then working with it to build systems that support who you want to become. There's a widespread belief that success in changing habits, whether forming new ones or breaking old ones, comes down to willpower. The idea is that if you just want it badly enough or try hard enough, you'll succeed. But neuroscience tells a very different story. Willpower is real, but it's also limited, depletable, and heavily influenced by your internal and external environment. The brain doesn't rely on willpower to guide most of your behavior. In fact, the vast majority of your daily actions are automatic, governed by subconscious cues and internal physiological states. That means the key to long-term behavior change lies not in motivation, but in managing the systems that shape your behavior. One of the most powerful systems you can harness is your environment. The brain is highly sensitive to contextual cues, sights, sounds, lighting, spatial layout, all of which influence behavior far more than most people realize. If your phone is within reach, you're more likely to pick it up. If junk food is on the counter, your chances of eating it skyrocket. The reason isn't laziness, it's biology. The brain evolved to conserve energy and respond to environmental prompts. Every time you see a cue associated with a habit, the basal ganglia and dopaminergic system activate in anticipation of that habit. The behavior becomes easier to perform not because of discipline, but because the path of least resistance has been laid out neurologically and physically. So, if you're trying to form a new habit like journaling, meditating, or reading, the first step isn't motivation. It's designing your environment to support that habit, make the behavior visible, easy, and attractive. Leave the journal on your pillow, place your meditation cushion next to the coffee maker, set your book on your desk where your phone used to sit. These cues prime your nervous system for the desired behavior. Now let's flip that. If you're trying to break a bad habit, you must make that behavior less convenient, less visible, and more difficult to perform. Delete the app, unplug the console, put the snacks out of reach, or don't buy them at all. What you're doing is not just reducing temptation, you're reducing dopamine cues that trigger the habit loop. But environment is only half of the equation. The other half is biological state, specifically, how your energy, hormones, and brain chemistry affect your ability to make good decisions. For example, when you're sleep deprived, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, is less active. This makes you far more likely to default to automatic behaviors, many of which are not aligned with your goals. Cortisol and glucose levels also play a major role. High cortisol makes you more reactive and stress-driven. Low blood glucose impairs judgment. This is why many people struggle with habits late in the day. Their cognitive resources are depleted. It's not weakness, it's a predictable drop in neurobiological readiness. Fortunately, you can counteract this with proactive physiological triggers. Tools like morning sunlight exposure, cold exposure, deliberate breathwork, and movement early in the day all raise levels of norepinephrine and dopamine, which increase alertness, motivation, and focus. These inputs set your brain up to be more receptive to deliberate behavior and less reactive to old patterns. Another key biological variable is timing. Your brain and body operate on a circadian rhythm, a 24-hour internal clock that influences hormone release, temperature, alertness, and mood. The first 3 hours after waking are when your dopaminergic system is most plastic, meaning it's primed for building and reinforcing new circuits. This is the ideal window to stack in habits you want to build. For example, if you want to start a journaling or breathwork practice, doing it in the morning reinforces the behavior more deeply than doing it late at night when your system is shutting down. Even more powerful is habit stacking, linking a new habit to an already established one. For instance, doing 10 push-ups right after brushing your teeth, or drinking water immediately after a morning walk. By chaining new behaviors to existing routines, you take advantage of already formed neural patterns, reducing the cognitive load required to execute the new habit. This approach removes willpower from the equation. Instead of forcing your brain to remember or resist, you're building habits into the structure of your day and the architecture of your environment. It's system design, not self-control. Ultimately, changing behavior means changing brain circuits. That doesn't happen with effort alone. It happens with consistent inputs at the right times of day, under the right physiological conditions, and within well-designed environments. So, instead of asking, "How can I be more disciplined?" ask, "How can I make this behavior easier to do and harder to avoid?" That's the question that aligns with how your nervous system actually works. Behavior is brain wiring. And wiring follows structure. Lasting behavior change, whether you're building a new habit or breaking an old one, doesn't happen because of inspiration or motivation. It happens because of something far more fundamental: neuroplasticity. This is the brain's ability to rewire itself, to change its structure and function in response to experience, repetition, and focused attention. Neuroplasticity is not just a concept, it's a measurable, observable biological process. At its core, it means that neurons, the cells in your brain, form new connections, strengthen existing ones, or prune away those that are no longer used. In other words, your brain is constantly adapting to how you think, behave, and feel. Now, when it comes to habits, neuroplasticity is the engine behind the scenes. Every time you perform a behavior, especially when it's done with focused attention, you're activating specific neural circuits. The more often you activate those circuits, the more myelin wraps around the axons of those neurons, like insulation on a wire, making the signal faster and more efficient. This is how behaviors become automatic. It's also why repetition is so critical. There's a phrase in neuroscience: neurons that fire together wire together. This wiring together is how a cue becomes linked to a behavior, and how that behavior becomes easier to perform over time. It's also how habits form. Once a loop is wired, let's say, stress right arrow smoking right arrow relief, the brain treats it as a shortcut. And shortcuts, neurologically speaking, are energy-saving mechanisms, but here's the most empowering insight: plasticity works both ways. You can unwire old circuits just as surely as you can build new ones. When you stop reinforcing a habit loop by no longer responding to the cue with the same behavior, the neural connections involved in that behavior begin to weaken. This is called long-term depression, not the emotional state, but the biological process where underused synapses lose strength and fade over time. However, for neuroplasticity to work, for real, lasting change to occur, several ingredients need to be present. First is attention. Plasticity requires focused engagement. If you're distracted while doing a new behavior, say, exercising while mindlessly scrolling your phone, the brain doesn't fully encode the pattern. But when you're deeply focused and emotionally engaged in what you're doing, your brain marks the experience as significant and is more likely to restructure itself in response. Second is repetition. A single experience won't change your brain. Repeated activation is required to turn a conscious behavior into an unconscious habit. And the number of repetitions matters more than the duration. It's better to perform a behavior for 2 minutes daily than 20 minutes once a week. Regularity teaches the brain that this behavior is relevant. Third is emotional salience. Experiences that carry emotional weight, whether positive or negative, create stronger neural imprints. If you tie a new habit to a feeling of pride, purpose, or momentum, the circuit for that habit is more likely to stick. Similarly, if a bad habit is tied to shame or regret, your brain may avoid it in the future, but only if that emotional reaction is connected to a new behavior, not just guilt. Fourth is timing. Your brain is more plastic at certain times of day, particularly in the first few hours after waking. This is when neuromodulators like acetylcholine, dopamine, and norepinephrine are naturally elevated, which makes the brain more receptive to change. Practicing your new habit during this window enhances learning and retention, and finally, rest and sleep are crucial. Neuroplasticity doesn't just happen during the behavior, it continues during deep sleep. That's when the brain consolidates the new neural patterns you've activated during the day. Without sufficient sleep, the circuits you worked so hard to reinforce may not fully take hold. All of this points to one powerful conclusion. Changing your habits means changing your brain. And your brain changes not by force, but by structured repetition, focused attention, emotional engagement, and consistency. So if you're trying to develop a new habit, whether it's writing every morning, exercising, meditating, or eating healthier, understand that each time you perform that behavior, you're not just doing it, you're actually sculpting your brain down to the cellular and molecular level. Over time, what once felt hard or unnatural becomes automatic, because the neural pathways have been reshaped. Likewise, if you're trying to break a habit, recognize that there will be friction, not because you're weak, but because your brain is trying to maintain what it has already wired. But the moment you stop rewarding the old loop and begin reinforcing a new one, the brain begins to adapt. Real change isn't just about doing something differently. It's about becoming someone different from the inside out. That transformation doesn't require perfection. It requires plasticity and the consistency to activate it.